Commander Ves Kathier had served in the Salash Navy for 32 cycles, and in all that time, the edge of the old human border had never given her a single reason to worry. It was a quiet stretch of space, cold, dark, and empty. The kind of place fleet officers were sent when their superiors wanted them out of the way. She stood on the bridge of the patrol cruiser Windward Reach, watching the long-range scanners sweep the same dead systems they always swept. Red dwarf stars, broken asteroid belts, the husks of old space stations that nobody had bothered to salvage in 100 years. This was the border of what used to be called the Terran Expanse, back when humans still existed as a spacefaring people. Nobody really talked about humans anymore. They were a story parents told their children, a cautionary tale about a species that grew too proud and vanished into nothing. 100 years ago, every human world had gone dark on the same day. Every human ship, every human colony, every human voice, across 1,000 light-years of space, silenced within the space of a single rotation. No wreckage, no distress calls, no bodies. Just silence. The coalition of free systems, the alliance of species that now controlled most of known space, had spent decades investigating the disappearance. Theories ranged from a self-inflicted plague to a rival power nobody had ever detected. Some said the humans had found a way to leave this galaxy entirely. Others said they had simply died out from arrogance, the same way a fire burns brightest right before it goes out. Whatever the truth was, the coalition had moved into the empty human systems without much guilt. Territory was territory. Nobody was using it anymore. Ves had grown up hearing these stories from her grandmother, who used to say that humans were dangerous, even in their absence, because a mystery like that never really stayed buried. Ves used to laugh at that as a child. She was not laughing now. "Commander, I'm getting something strange on the deep scanner," said Lieutenant Oren Peth, the young Dorun sensor officer at the far station. His voice had an edge to it that made Ves turn around immediately. "Define strange," she said. "There's a gravitational disturbance at the edge of the old Sol Reach system. It wasn't there 10 minutes ago. It's not a comet, it's not debris, and it's too small to be a black hole event. It just appeared." Ves walked over to his station and looked at the readout herself. The number was strange indeed. Something massive had entered real space, in a system that had been catalogued as completely dead for 90 years. Sol Reach had been one of humanity's core systems once, according to the old star charts. Now it was just an unremarkable yellow star with a scattering of lifeless planets. "Could be a natural phenomenon," she said, more to reassure herself than anyone else. "It's not natural, Commander. The gravitational signature has structure to it. It's a drive signature. Something jumped into that system, and it's big." Ves felt the old stories crawl up the back of her neck. She pushed the feeling down and focused on her duty. "Send a probe. Passive scan only. No active pings. I don't want to announce ourselves to whatever that is until we know what we're dealing with." The probe launched from the Windward Reach and streaked silently towards Sol Reach, its stealth systems keeping it hidden from all but the most sensitive detection equipment. It took nearly 4 hours to reach the system and begin transmitting data back. Ves spent that time pacing the bridge, drinking cup after cup of bitter Salash tea, trying not to imagine what she might find. When the data came back, the entire bridge crew went silent. There, hanging in orbit around the 4th planet of the Sol Reach system, was a ship. It was enormous, larger than anything in the Coalition's current fleet by a wide margin, built from a smooth gray metal that seemed to drink in the starlight around it rather than reflect it. It bristled with what looked like weapon emplacements, dozens of them, though the probe's sensors couldn't get a clear read on their function. The hull carried markings in a script that Ves recognized immediately from her history lessons. Human lettering. "That's not possible," whispered Oren. "There hasn't been a single human ship detected in 100 years. Not one." "Well, there's one now," Ves said, though her voice came out quieter than she intended. She ordered the probe to hold position and continue passive scanning, staying well outside any range that might trigger a defensive response from the mystery ship. Over the next several hours, more data trickled in. The vessel was not alone. As the probe expanded its scanning radius, it detected 6 more ships of similar design entering the system, arriving in staggered waves, as though they were regrouping after a long journey. Each one was different in size and shape, but they all carried the same gray hull, the same dense weapon arrays, the same quiet confidence of something that did not expect to be challenged. Vess sent an emergency dispatch to Coalition Central Command, flagging the discovery as critical. She expected a swift response. Instead, she got silence for nearly 6 hours, which told her that somewhere far above her pay grade, people were arguing about what to do. When the response finally came, it was not from a fleet admiral. It was from a diplomat, a smooth-voiced Vren named Ambassador Corel Sen, who had apparently been pulled out of a retirement posting because he was one of the few living officials who had actually studied pre-disappearance human culture. "Commander Kathir," Corel said through the comm link, his image flickering slightly on the bridge display. "I want you to understand the gravity of what you've found. If those ships are genuinely of human origin, and if humans are genuinely returning, this changes everything about the current balance of power in this sector. I need you to maintain observation, avoid all contact, and report every change in their behavior. Do not, under any circumstances, engage." "Understood, Ambassador. Can you tell me anything about what we're dealing with? Nobody has laid eyes on a human warship in a century. We don't know their capabilities, their intentions, anything." There was a pause on the line. "That's the problem, Commander. 100 years ago, human military technology was roughly comparable to our own. Impressive, but not overwhelming. If they've spent that 100 years developing in isolation, wherever they went, there's no telling what they've built. I've reviewed the sensor telemetry your probe sent back. Frankly, it terrifies me." Vess looked at the tactical display again, at the 7 ships now gathered in a loose formation around the 4th planet of a system that used to be called Earth's home. Even from a distance, even filtered through the limited data of a passive scan, something about their presence felt different from anything she had encountered before. Not aggressive exactly, not yet, but heavy, with a kind of quiet certainty, like a predator that had never once considered the possibility of losing a fight. "What do we do if they start moving toward Coalition space?" she asked. "Then we pray they remember why they left in the first place," Corel said, "and we hope it wasn't because of something we did." That last comment hung in the air long after the connection closed. Vess had never heard that theory before, that the Coalition itself might have had something to do with humanity's disappearance. She filed it away, along with a growing list of questions that nobody seemed able to answer. Over the following 2 days, more ships arrived in the Sol Reach system. What had started as 7 vessels grew to nearly 40, arranged in a formation that any trained naval officer would recognize as a staging fleet, the kind of gathering that happened before a larger deployment. Vess kept her probe running, kept her reports flowing to Central Command, and kept a careful watch on the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. On the 3rd day, something changed. A single ship broke away from the main formation, smaller than the others but still larger than the Windward Reach, and began moving on a course that would take it directly toward Coalition-controlled space. Not in a straight line, not in an obviously threatening trajectory, but moving nonetheless, cutting through the dead systems of the old Terran expanse, like it was retracing a path it remembered by heart. "Commander, that ship is heading our way," Oren said, his voice tight with tension. "Current course puts it within scanning range of our position, in about 11 hours. Vess stared at the display, at the small blinking icon representing a piece of human hardware, more advanced than anything the Coalition had ever built, moving steadily closer to her ship, to her crew, to the border she had spent 32 quiet cycles guarding. "Signal Central Command," she said. "Tell them the wait is over. Humanity is coming back, and it looks like they're not asking for permission." She sat down in her command chair and watched the blinking icon creep closer across the star chart, hour by hour, and found herself thinking about her grandmother's old warning. A mystery like that never really stays buried. She had laughed at those words once. She was not laughing now, and somewhere deep down, she suspected the entire galaxy was about to stop laughing along with her. The bridge lights dimmed slightly as the ship shifted to a heightened alert posture. A quiet hum settling over the crew as they prepared for a first contact nobody had trained for, with a species everybody had assumed was gone forever. Vess Kathir took a slow breath, straightened her uniform, and waited for the single most important moment of her career to arrive, one silent hour at a time. Far beyond the edge of Coalition space, in the heart of the old Sol Reach system, the human fleet continued its quiet assembly, ship after ship folding into real space, from wherever it was they had spent the last 100 years. None of them broadcast a single signal. None of them explained themselves. They simply gathered, patient and unhurried, like a storm, taking its time to build, before it finally broke. The single human ship crossed into what the Coalition considered its own territory, exactly 11 hours after Commander Ves Kathir first spotted it on her scanners, and it did so without firing a single shot, without sending a single message, and without slowing down even slightly. It simply moved through the invisible borderline as though it did not exist, which, from a certain point of view, it did not. That line had only ever been drawn by species who assumed humanity was never coming back to argue about it. Ves had spent the 11 hours preparing her crew as best she could. She pulled every old Coalition file on human military doctrine, most of them a century out of date and written by analysts who were probably long dead. She briefed her officers on the little that was known about human psychology, human tactics, human history. It amounted to almost nothing useful. The files described a species that fought hard, negotiated harder, and rarely started conflicts they did not intend to finish. None of that told her what to expect from a ship that had spent 100 years growing into something the files had never imagined. "Commander, the vessel has entered active scanning range," Orun reported, his voice steady, despite the sweat visible on his forehead. "It's scanning us. Full spectrum, not trying to hide it at all." "Let it scan," Ves said. "We have nothing to hide either. Hold position. Weapons on standby but not powered." "I don't want them thinking we're posturing for a fight." The bridge crew watched the tactical display in silence as the human ship closed the distance, slowing now as it approached the windward reach, until it settled into a stable position roughly 10,000 kilometers away. Close enough to be a serious threat if it wanted to be, far enough to suggest it wasn't looking for trouble, at least not yet. Then, for the first time in 100 years, a human voice reached Coalition ears. "Unidentified Coalition vessel. This is the human scout ship Clear Horizon. We are not here to engage in hostilities. We request a channel be opened with your commanding officer for the purposes of establishing contact. Please respond." The voice was calm, almost pleasant, carrying none of the menace that the ship's weapon-heavy silhouette suggested it should. Ves exchanged a glance with her communications officer, a nervous young Salish named Petra Ilm, and nodded. "This is Commander Ves Kathir, of the Coalition cruiser Windward Reach. Channel is open. Go ahead, Clear Horizon." There was a brief pause, filled with the faint hiss of static, before the voice returned. "Commander Kathir, thank you for responding. My name is Captain Reyes Okafor, Commanding Officer of the Clear Horizon. I understand this contact is unexpected. I want to assure you that we are not here to threaten Coalition territory or its people. We are conducting a reconnaissance survey of systems that once belonged to human civilization." "Captain Okafor," Ves said carefully, "your species has been absent from known space for 100 years. Forgive me if I find it difficult to simply accept a claim of peaceful intentions from a fleet of warships that appeared without warning." Another pause, longer this time. When Okafor spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something that sounded almost like weariness. "That's a fair position to hold, Commander. I won't pretend otherwise. A great deal has happened to us in the last century, and I understand that from your perspective, we simply vanished and then returned carrying weapons nobody has seen before. I would ask for the same patience you'd want if the situation were reversed." Ves considered her next words carefully. She was aware that every word of this conversation was being recorded, analyzed, and would likely be studied by Coalition strategists for years to come. She had no intention of starting the most significant diplomatic event in a century by being needlessly hostile, but she also had no intention of being naive. "What happened to your people, Captain? Where did you go?" There was the longest pause yet. When Okafor finally answered, his tone had shifted again, quieter, more measured, like a man choosing his words with great care. "That's a longer story than I can tell you over an open channel, Commander, and it's not entirely mine to tell. What I can tell you is that we did not leave by choice, not at first, and what we found on the other side of that departure changed us in ways your Coalition is not prepared for." "Changed you how?" "You'll see soon enough. My mission here is simple reconnaissance, Commander. I have no orders to engage your forces, and I would strongly prefer we both avoid any misunderstanding that leads to violence. I am transmitting a data packet now. It contains a formal request for contact with Coalition leadership. Nothing more. A moment later, Petra confirmed the data packet had arrived, small and carefully encrypted, containing exactly what Okafor described. No hidden commands, no viral code, nothing but a simple diplomatic request, written in careful, formal language, asking for a meeting between human representatives and whatever passed for Coalition authority these days. Vess stared at the tactical display, at the human ship sitting patiently at the edge of weapons range, making no aggressive moves, asking politely for a conversation. It was almost more unsettling than an outright attack would have been. An attack she understood. An attack fit the old stories about human pride and human fury. This calm, careful patience did not fit any story she had ever heard. "I'll forward your request to Coalition Central Command, Captain," she said. "I can't promise how quickly they'll respond, given the circumstances." "I understand, Commander. We're not in a hurry. We've waited 100 years. We can wait a little longer for the right conversation to happen." There was something almost sad in the way he said it. A tiredness that didn't match the image of a conquering fleet returning in triumph. The channel closed, and Vess sat back in her chair, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of the ship's systems. "Commander," Orun said quietly, "should I keep monitoring the ship?" "Yes. And keep monitoring Soul Reach too. If that fleet starts moving in force, I want to know the second it happens." Vess rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the last 3 days pressing down on her. "Petra, get me a priority line to Ambassador Sen. He needs to hear this conversation, word for word." While Petra worked to establish the connection, Vess found herself staring out at the image of the clear horizon on the main view screen, its gray hull catching starlight in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the ship itself had been designed to look calm and unthreatening, despite everything it clearly was capable of. She thought about Okafor's voice, about the exhaustion buried under his careful diplomacy, about his refusal to explain what had happened to his people. "Changed us in ways your coalition is not prepared for." The words sat heavy in her chest. Ambassador Karel Sen's response, when it finally came through hours later, carried a similar note of caution mixed with barely contained urgency. "You did well, Commander. Central Command is convening an emergency session of the Coalition Council within the hour. They want to accept the human request for contact, but there's significant disagreement about how and where and under what terms. Some of the council members are pushing for a show of force instead, a demonstration that the Coalition is not intimidated by a returning power. With respect, Ambassador, I don't think a show of force is wise. Not against a fleet that outnumbers and possibly outguns anything we currently have stationed in this sector. I agree with you, Commander, and I've said as much in council. But fear makes people do foolish things, and there is a great deal of fear circulating right now. I need you to hold your position, maintain contact if the humans reach out again, and above all, do not provoke them. I'll do what I can on my end to keep cooler heads in charge of this decision." The connection closed, and Vess found herself alone with her thoughts once more, watching the patient, unmoving shape of the clear horizon on her view screen. Somewhere far beyond it, the greater human fleet continued to gather in the ruins of their old home system, waiting for something, though she could not begin to guess what. 2 more days passed, in a strange, tense quiet. The clear horizon held its position, occasionally sending short status updates confirming it remained in place, awaiting a coalition response. Vess used the time to gather every scrap of information her sensors could pull from a distance, cataloging weapon signatures, hull configurations, engine outputs, anything that might help the strategists back home understand what they were truly facing. Then, on the morning of the 6th day since first contact, Central Command finally sent its answer. The Coalition Council had agreed to a formal meeting, to be held at a neutral station near the border, with representatives from both the Coalition and the returning human fleet. Vess was ordered to escort the clear horizon to the coordinates, and to maintain security along the route. When she relayed the message to Captain Okafor, his response came almost immediately, calm and steady as always. "Thank you, Commander. We'll be ready to depart within the hour. And Commander, for what it's worth, I hope this conversation goes well. I truly do. My people did not come back to fight the same wars we once fought. But I won't pretend we're prepared to be pushed around either, not after everything it cost us to come home." Vess closed the channel and looked out at the stars, at the small human ship preparing to follow her, toward a meeting that would likely determine the fate of the entire sector, and felt, for the first time since this whole strange affair began, a small flicker of something that might have been hope. The neutral station chosen for the meeting was called Meridian Point, a battered old trading post that had sat at the edge of Coalition space for nearly 2 centuries, older even than the disappearance of humanity itself. It had been built by a long-dead alliance of merchants who wanted a safe place to trade without worrying about which government's territory they were standing in, and it had survived every political shift since, simply by staying useful and staying neutral. Ves Katir had passed by it a dozen times over the years without ever setting foot inside. Now she found herself standing in its central docking bay, watching a delegation of human representatives disembark from the clear horizon for the first time in 100 years of Coalition history. Captain Reyes Okafor walked at the front of the small group, dressed in a dark gray uniform, with minimal decoration, nothing like the ceremonial finery Ves had expected from a species making such a dramatic return. Beside him walked 2 others, a tall woman with sharp eyes who was introduced as Fleet Analyst Dara Voss, and an older man with a quiet, watchful presence named Ambassador Julian Reyes, no relation to the captain despite the shared name, who apparently held the actual authority to speak on behalf of whatever human government now existed. On the Coalition side, Ambassador Corel Sen led the delegation, flanked by representatives from 3 of the major member species and a small security detail that everyone understood was purely symbolic. If this meeting turned violent, a handful of guards with sidearms would do nothing against the kind of firepower sitting in orbit above the station. The 2 groups met in a wide, circular chamber near the station's core, its walls lined with old star charts from a dozen different civilizations, layered over each other like sediment. Ves had been asked to attend as a witness to the proceedings, given her role as the first to make contact, and she took a seat near the back of the room, watching the 2 sides settle across from one another at a long table. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting," Ambassador Julian Reyes began, his voice calm and unhurried. "I understand the appearance of our fleet has caused considerable alarm across the Coalition. I want to begin by saying clearly and directly that we did not return to reclaim territory by force, and we did not return to start a war." Corel Sen studied the man across from him with the careful patience of a diplomat who had learned long ago never to trust a first statement without pressing for details. "Then perhaps you could explain, Ambassador, why you returned with a fleet capable of leveling entire star systems, rather than a single envoy ship. Forgive my directness, but the Coalition has spent 100 years believing your species extinct. Waking up to find otherwise, and finding it in the form of an armed fleet, does not inspire confidence in peaceful intentions." Julian nodded slowly, as though he had expected exactly this response. "That's a fair question, and I intend to answer it honestly, even though the truth is not simple." He glanced briefly at Dara Voss, who gave a small nod, before continuing. 103 years ago, humanity did not choose to leave known space. We were forced out. A murmur passed through the Coalition side of the table. Ves leaned forward slightly, listening intently. "Forced by whom?" Corel asked. "We don't fully know, even now," Julian admitted. "What we know is this. A power emerged from beyond the boundaries of explored space, something older and stronger than anything catalogued in any species records, human or otherwise. It attacked our core systems without warning, without demands, without any attempt at communication. Within days, it became clear that we could not defend our worlds against it. So our leadership made the hardest decision in our history. We evacuated everyone we could reach, every ship, every colony that had the means to run, and we fled through an experimental transit corridor our scientists had been developing for deep space exploration. It was untested, dangerous, and one-directional. We had no way to know where it would take us, or whether we would ever find our way back. The chamber had gone completely silent. Even Corel Sen, a man known throughout the Coalition for his unshakable composure, sat with his mouth slightly open. "Where did it take you?" he finally asked. "Somewhere far beyond anything your star charts have ever mapped," Julian said. "A region of space we've come to call the Deep Reach. It was hostile in ways we were not prepared for, filled with dangers that made the enemy who drove us from our home look almost gentle by comparison. We lost a great many people in those first years, entire generations who never saw the inside of a stable, peaceful system, But we survived, and in surviving, we learned. We had no choice but to become better at building, better at fighting, better at defending what little we had left, because the alternative was extinction. Dara Voss spoke for the first time, her voice sharper and more clinical than the ambassador's. The ships you've seen are the result of 100 years of that necessity. We did not build them to conquer the coalition. We built them because in the deep reach, a fleet that could not defend itself did not survive long enough to matter. Vess found herself thinking back to Captain Okafor's words on that first day of contact. Changed us in ways your coalition is not prepared for. She was beginning to understand exactly what he had meant, and the understanding did nothing to ease the tight knot forming in her chest. And the enemy that drove you out, Corell said carefully. Is it still out there? Could it follow you back? Julian's expression turned grave. We don't know for certain. We spent decades trying to understand what it was, where it came from, why it attacked without provocation. We never got clear answers. What we do know is that roughly 2 years ago, our scientists finally succeeded in stabilizing a return path through the same kind of transit corridor that took us away. We debated for a long time whether returning was even wise, given the uncertainty of whether that enemy still hunted the space we'd left behind. In the end, we decided that hiding forever was not a future worth having. We came back to reclaim our home, to find out what became of the worlds we left, and yes, Ambassador, to be ready in case whatever drove us out ever finds its way here as well. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as the weight of that statement settled over everyone present. Vess glanced at the faces of the coalition delegates around the table and saw a mixture of fear, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. The coalition had spent a century treating humanity's absence as an opportunity, carving up their old territory, building on their old worlds, without ever truly investigating what had caused the disappearance in the first place. Nobody had wanted to look too closely at a mystery that seemed to be working out so conveniently in their favor. I understand this is difficult to hear, Julian continued, his voice softening slightly. And I understand that our territory is now home to coalition citizens who have built lives there over the past century. We are not here to demand you simply leave. We want to negotiate a peaceful resolution, one that acknowledges both our history and the reality of what the last 100 years has made of your civilizations and ours. But I need the coalition to understand something clearly. We will not be pushed aside again. Not by an unknown enemy, and not by anyone within known space either. If this negotiation fails, and if the coalition chooses to see our return as a threat to be eliminated, rather than a situation to be resolved peacefully, we are prepared to defend ourselves, thoroughly. Corell Sen sat back in his chair, processing the weight of everything he had just heard. Around the table, the other coalition representatives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the balance of power in the sector. Ambassador Reyes, Corell finally said, I believe I speak for the Coalition Council when I say that we have no desire for conflict with your people, especially not against an enemy capable of doing what you've described to a civilization as advanced as your own once was. But you must understand our position as well. We have citizens, infrastructure, and history built on worlds you consider your own. Any resolution will need to account for that reality, not simply erase it. I agree completely, Julian said. That's precisely why we're here talking, instead of simply taking back what we lost by force. We're prepared to discuss shared governance, resource agreements, whatever framework allows both our peoples to move forward without violence. But I want to be honest with you, Ambassador Sen, about something else as well. Go on. The fleet currently gathered in the Soul Reach system is not our entire military. It is a fraction of it, sent ahead to assess the situation and begin these negotiations. The rest remains further out, still finishing the long journey back from the deep reach. I tell you this, not as a threat, but because I believe trust has to start somewhere, and hiding the true scale of our return would be a poor way to begin building it. Vess watched Corell Sen absorb that statement, watched the careful diplomat do the mental math of just how outmatched the coalition truly was, and understood in that moment that the balance of power across known space had shifted permanently, whether anyone in this room was ready for it or not. The meeting continued for several more hours, covering logistics, timelines, and the delicate question of which worlds might eventually be returned to human governance, and which would remain under coalition administration. No firm agreements were reached that day, but something more important happened instead. Both sides left the table without hostility, with a tentative understanding that further talks would follow, and with a shared, unspoken awareness that whatever had chased humanity out of known space 100 years ago might still be out there, somewhere in the dark, and that this was a problem far larger than old territorial disputes. As the human delegation returned to their ship, Vess found herself walking alongside Captain Okafor toward the docking bay, the two of them falling into step almost naturally. "You didn't say much in there," Okafor observed. "I was listening," Vess said. "I think there was a lot worth listening to." He gave her a small, tired smile. There usually is, when the truth finally comes out. He paused at the airlock leading back to the clear horizon and looked back at her. "For what it's worth, Commander, I'm glad it was you who found us first. You handled it better than most would have." "I nearly panicked," Vess admitted. "Nearly isn't the same as actually panicking," Okafor said. "That's usually the difference that matters most." He stepped through the airlock, offering a final nod before it closed behind him, leaving Vess standing alone in the docking bay, thinking about everything she had just learned, and about the unknown enemy still waiting somewhere, out in the dark, beyond the edges of every star chart anyone had ever drawn. 3 weeks after the meeting at Meridian Point, the fragile peace between the Coalition and the returning human fleet was tested in a way nobody had expected. It did not come from a human warship or a Coalition warfleet. It came from the dark, silent edge of the old Terran expanse, in the very system where Vess Kathir had first spotted the strange gravitational disturbance that started this entire chain of events. She was back at her post aboard the Windward Reach, still assigned to monitor the border while the diplomats continued their slow, careful negotiations, when Lieutenant Oren Peth called her over to his station, with a voice tight with alarm. "Commander, I'm picking up something at the edge of Sol Reach. It's not a human signature. It's not anything in our database." Vess crossed the bridge quickly and studied the readout over his shoulder. The gravitational pattern was different from anything she had seen before, sharper, more violent, tearing through the fabric of space in a way that made her skin crawl just looking at the numbers. "Get me a visual," she ordered. The image that resolved on the main screen a few minutes later showed something massive emerging from a rupture in space near the outer edge of the Sol Reach system, close to where the human fleet still maintained its staging position. It was not a single ship. It was a formation of dozens, then hundreds of vessels, dark and jagged, utterly unlike anything catalogued by Coalition or human records. Their hulls seemed to bend the light around them, making them difficult to look at directly, as though the eye itself resisted focusing on their shape. "That's it," Vess whispered, the realization settling over her like a physical weight. "That's the enemy Ambassador Reyes told us about. It followed them home." Within minutes, a priority alert flashed across every Coalition and human communication channel simultaneously, a broadcast originating from the human flagship stationed at Sol Reach. Captain Okafor's voice came through, stripped of its usual calm, replaced with the sharp urgency of a man who had been dreading this exact moment for years. "This is Captain Reyes Okafor, of the human fleet, broadcasting on all available channels. Unknown hostile forces have entered the Sol Reach system in significant numbers. We believe this to be the same enemy responsible for our original displacement 103 years ago. All Coalition vessels are advised to maintain distance and prepare defensive postures. This is not a drill." Vess felt her stomach drop. The old fear that had lived quietly in the back of every Coalition mind since the humans first returned. The fear of an unknown enemy powerful enough to drive away an entire spacefaring civilization was no longer a story. It was sitting on her sensors, growing larger by the minute. "Commander, orders?" Petra Ilm asked from the communication station, her voice tight with fear. "Signal Central Command. Tell them exactly what we're seeing. And get me a line to the human fleet. I want to know what they need from us." While Petra worked, Vess watched the tactical display with growing dread as the enemy formation began to move, not toward Coalition space, but directly toward the gathered human fleet at Sol Reach. Whatever this enemy was, it seemed to have tracked humanity specifically, following the trail of their return, through the same transit corridor they had used to come home. The first exchange of fire happened less than 20 minutes later. Vess watched the sensor feed with a mixture of horror and awe as the human fleet, the same ships that had seemed so overwhelming when a single vessel arrived at her border, engaged the enemy formation in open battle. The tactics were unlike anything in coalition doctrine. Coordinated bursts of concentrated fire from multiple vessels striking single enemy targets simultaneously. Rapid formation shifts that seemed almost impossible given the size of the ships involved. Defensive screens that absorbed attacks that should have vaporized a smaller vessel outright. "They're actually holding," Orun said, disbelief evident in his voice. "Commander, look at the exchange ratio. The humans are taking losses, but they're inflicting far more damage than they're receiving." Vess allowed herself a small measure of relief, though it was tempered by the sheer scale of destruction visible on her screen. Ships were dying on both sides, human and enemy alike, brilliant flashes of light marking the deaths of vessels and the crews inside them. This was not a demonstration of power for its own sake. This was a desperate, real fight for survival. Exactly the kind of fight that had shaped humanity into what it had become over the last century. A priority channel opened, and Ambassador Julian Reyes's voice came through, strained but controlled. "Commander Kathir, I understand you're in a position to relay information directly to Coalition Central Command. I need you to convey a request. We are engaging the enemy at Sol Reach, but we cannot hold this line indefinitely without reinforcement. If this enemy breaks through our fleet, it will not stop at the old human border. Whatever quarrel it has with us, I do not believe it will show any more mercy to your people than it showed to ours." Vess relayed the message immediately, and within the hour, an emergency session of the Coalition Council convened to debate a question that, 3 weeks earlier, would have seemed unthinkable: whether to send coalition forces to fight alongside the very fleet that had, until recently, been viewed as an existential threat to coalition security. The debate was fierce. Some council members argued that this was exactly the kind of trap a returning power might use to draw coalition forces into a costly, weakening conflict. Others argued that if the enemy truly was as dangerous as it appeared, and if it truly did not intend to stop at any arbitrary border, then the only sensible choice was to fight it now, alongside an ally with 100 years of hard-won experience against it, rather than face it alone later without that experience. In the end, it was Ambassador Karel Sen who tipped the balance, standing before the full council to deliver a short, direct argument that Vess would later hear replayed on countless news channels. "We spent 100 years benefiting from humanity's absence without ever asking what caused it. We owe them, at minimum, the courtesy of standing beside them, now that the true cost of that absence has finally caught up to all of us. If we refuse, and this enemy succeeds in defeating them, do any of you truly believe it will simply turn around and leave the rest of us in peace?" The council authorized an emergency deployment within the hour. Vess found herself receiving orders that both thrilled and terrified her. The Windward Reach, along with a small task force of coalition vessels stationed nearby, was to proceed immediately to Sol Reach and render assistance to the human fleet. "All hands, this is the commander," Vess announced over the ship's intercom, her voice steadier than she felt. "We are moving to engage a hostile force alongside the human fleet at Sol Reach. I won't pretend this isn't dangerous. I won't pretend we fully understand what we're facing. But I believe, and I think most of you believe too, that this is the right thing to do. Prepare for combat operations. Let's show them the coalition can hold its own when it matters most." The journey to Sol Reach took several hours, during which Vess monitored the ongoing battle, with a knot of anxiety that never fully loosened. By the time her small task force arrived at the edge of the system, the human fleet had been fighting continuously for nearly 6 hours, their formation battered but still holding, still inflicting steady losses on an enemy force that showed no signs of retreating or slowing its aggression. "Commander, we're being hailed," Petra reported as the Windward Reach dropped out of transit into the chaos of the battle. "It's Captain Okafor." His voice came through, exhausted but grateful. "Commander Kathir, I did not expect to see coalition ships out here, but I have never been happier to be wrong about something. We could use the extra firepower on our southern flank. The enemy is trying to encircle our slower support vessels. Send us the coordinates, Captain. We're on our way." What followed was, in Vess's own private assessment afterward, the most intense and terrifying experience of her entire career. The Windward Reach and its accompanying task force plunged into the edge of the battle, weapons blazing against an enemy whose ships absorbed damage in strange, unpredictable ways, their dark hulls seeming to shrug off attacks that should have torn through coalition armor without difficulty. It was only by fighting alongside human vessels, following the coordinated tactics relayed to her by Okafor's crew in real time, that Vess's task force managed to hold their section of the line and prevent the encirclement the enemy had been attempting. The battle raged for another 4 hours before the enemy formation, having suffered heavy losses without achieving its apparent objective, suddenly broke away and retreated back through the same kind of tear in space it had arrived through, vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. The Sol Reach system fell into an eerie, exhausted silence, littered with the wreckage of hundreds of ships from both sides. Vess sat in her command chair, breathing hard, watching the tactical display slowly clear of hostile contacts, and felt a wave of relief so strong it left her hands shaking. "Commander," Oren said quietly, We actually held." Across the shattered battlefield, Captain Okafor's voice came through one final time, quieter now, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. "Thank you, Commander Kathir. And please, thank your council, on behalf of every human who fought here today. We didn't know if anyone would come. I'm glad we were wrong to doubt it." Vess looked out at the wreckage drifting silently among the stars, human and coalition debris mixed together in a way that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier, and understood that whatever had happened here today had changed something far bigger than a single battle. It had changed the shape of the future itself, for both their peoples, whether the rest of the galaxy was ready for it or not. In the weeks that followed the battle at Sol Reach, the galaxy looked very different from the one Vess Kathir had known her entire life. News of the fight spread quickly across every coalition channel, carried by survivors, by sensor recordings, by the simple fact that hundreds of ships from two very different fleets had bled and burned side by side against a common enemy. What had begun as fear and suspicion toward the returning human fleet, slowly, unevenly, began to shift into something closer to respect, and in some quarters, genuine gratitude. Vess found herself summoned back to the coalition capital for the first time in years, called to testify before the full council about what she had witnessed at the border, at Meridian Point, and finally at Sol Reach itself. She stood in the same grand chamber where so many decisions about the fate of species had been made over the centuries, and told them everything, without embellishment and without hiding her own fear. "I want to be clear," she told the assembled council members, "that I do not believe the humans returned to conquer us. I believe they returned because they had nowhere else to go, and because they were finally strong enough to try. And I believe that whatever attacked them 100 years ago, and attacked them again at Sol Reach, is a threat to every species in this room, not just to humanity alone." Her testimony, combined with the sensor data and survivor accounts pouring in from the battle, helped tip the political balance firmly toward continued cooperation. Ambassador Corel Sen, exhausted but resolute, led a renewed round of negotiations with the human delegation, this time with far less suspicion and far more urgency. The question was no longer whether the coalition could trust the returning humans. It was how quickly both sides could establish a lasting alliance against whatever enemy loomed beyond the edges of known space. 6 weeks after the battle, Vess found herself once again at Meridian Point, this time not as a witness but as an invited participant in the signing of a formal treaty between the Coalition of Free Systems and what was now officially called the Restored Terran Fleet. The terms had taken weeks of careful negotiation to finalize. Coalition citizens living on former human worlds would remain, their communities protected under a shared governance framework. Human colonists would be permitted to resettle other worlds within the old Terran expanse, working alongside the coalition populations already established there. Resource agreements, trade routes, and joint military commands were established to formalize what had already happened in practice during the battle, humans and the coalition standing together. More importantly, both sides agreed to a joint task force dedicated entirely to understanding and eventually confronting the unknown enemy that had driven humanity from its home a century ago and returned to attack them again at Sol Reach. Human scientists, hardened by a century of survival in the hostile Deep Reach, began sharing their knowledge of the enemy's tactics and weaknesses with coalition military analysts. Coalition engineers, in turn, offered access to resources and manufacturing capacity that could help repair and expand the battered human fleet, still recovering from its long exile and its recent costly battle. Vess stood near the back of the signing ceremony, watching Ambassador Julian Reyes and Ambassador Karel Sen clasp hands after placing their signatures on the treaty, and felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. The immediate crisis had passed. The two civilizations had found a way to stand together instead of against each other, but the enemy that had started all of this remained out there, somewhere beyond the reach of any star chart, and nobody could say with certainty when, or if, it would return in greater force. After the ceremony, Captain Reyes Okafor found her near one of the station's wide viewing windows, looking out at the stars beyond. He looked different from the tired, cautious man who had first hailed her ship weeks earlier. There was something lighter in his expression now, though the exhaustion of the recent battle still lingered around his eyes. "Congratulations, Commander," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I understand you were instrumental in convincing your council to send help at Sol Reach." "I just told them the truth," Vess said. "The decision to act on it was theirs. Still, it mattered." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same stars she had been watching. "You know, when we first crossed back into known space, a lot of us expected to find nothing but hostility waiting for us. A century is a long time. We assumed the coalition would see us as invaders, or worse, would try to wipe us out before we became a threat. Finding people willing to stand beside us instead, that wasn't something most of my crew believed would actually happen. To be fair, Captain, a lot of us expected the opposite. We assumed you'd come back looking for revenge, ready to take back everything the coalition built on your old worlds by force." Okafor allowed himself a small, tired laugh. "I suppose we were both wrong about each other, in the best possible way." His expression sobered as he continued. "I won't pretend the road ahead is going to be easy, Commander. What attacked us at Sol Reach was not the full strength of whatever drove us out of known space a century ago. It was a fraction of it, probing our defenses, testing whether we had grown weak during our exile. I fear the true confrontation is still ahead of us, and when it comes, it may need everything both our peoples can offer, together." Vess nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "Then we'll be ready, all of us." "I believe that now," Okafor said, in a way I wasn't sure I could believe a few months ago. He extended a hand toward her, a very human gesture that had, over the past weeks, become increasingly familiar among the joint task forces now training together across the border. "Thank you, Commander Kathir, for your patience, at the very beginning, when patience wasn't the easy choice." Vess shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for choosing diplomacy first, Captain, when you could have simply taken what you wanted by force. I don't think either of us fully understood, back at the start of all this, just how much that choice would end up mattering." They stood together at the window for a while longer, watching the slow traffic of ships, human and coalition alike, moving between the docking bays of Meridian Point. Somewhere out beyond the edges of every known star chart, an ancient and unknown enemy waited in the dark, patient and unseen, the true scale of its intentions still a mystery. But for the first time in 100 years, the civilizations of known space did not face that uncertain future alone. They faced it together, bound by a fragile new alliance, forged in fire at Sol Reach, built on the hard lessons of a century of exile, and a single, cautious first contact, at the edge of a quiet, forgotten border. Vess Kathir returned to her post aboard the Windward Reach a changed officer, her quiet assignment at the edge of coalition space, no longer a place where nothing ever happened, but a critical junction between two allied fleets, now working side by side, to prepare for whatever came next. She kept her grandmother's old warning in mind more often now, not with fear, but with a kind of grim readiness. A mystery like humanity's disappearance never really stayed buried, her grandmother had always said. It had come back, after 100 years of silence, carrying warships and secrets and a threat that reached far beyond any single species' survival. But it had also come back carrying something else, something Vess had not expected when she first spotted that strange gravitational disturbance at the edge of a long-dead system. It had come back carrying the chance for something new to be built from the wreckage of the old, an alliance strong enough, perhaps, to finally face down whatever waited in the dark beyond the stars, together, and to make certain that whatever had once tried to erase humanity from existence would find both humanity and the coalition standing shoulder to shoulder the next time it dared to try again. The stars outside Meridian Point burned on, ancient and indifferent, as they always had, while behind their light, two civilizations quietly prepared for a war none of them had chosen, but all of them now understood they would have to fight, and win, together.